Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode number 23 of History for Shut-ins. Today's flag, although we're about a decade ahead of our time on our timeline, is the flag that was flying at Fort Sumter on April 13th, 1861, when Fort Sumter surrendered. Today, we are going to talk about the short-lived Liberty Party and its impact, as well as slavery, its expansion, the impact it has on the United States, and the presidencies of Zachary, Taylor, Millard, Fillmore. So stepping back a little bit, the Liberty Party was around from 1840 to 1848. It was created by abolitionists who believed in political action to further anti-slavery goals. In opposition to William Lloyd Garrison and his followers, who scorned political activity as futile and sinful in the battle to end slavery, a group of abolitionists met in Warsaw, New York, to organize the Liberty Party. They nominated James G. Birney, a Kentuckian and former slaveholder, for president. The party's first national convention took place at Albany, New York, on April 1st, 1840, when Birney's nomination was confirmed. And we had talked about this when we were talking about Martin Van Buren and such, and William Henry Harrison. Liberty Party supporters realized that the abolition of slavery in the South would not occur through political action. They hoped to pressure legislators into taking their anti-slavery positions of the party, and for legislators to take an even firmer position, preventing slavery from spreading beyond the interstate slave trade and the institution itself within the boundaries of Washington, D.C. Although its vote totals were small, the Liberty Party played an important role in the evolution of political anti-slavery. Even though the party was made up of abolitionists, they accepted the pre-Civil War consensus that the Constitution gave Congress no authority to interfere with slavery in the states. This view was so widespread in both the North and the South that only a small minority of abolitionists challenged it. When the Slavery Party broke up, it then became the Free Soil Party. In October of 1845, Abraham Lincoln writes, quote, "I hold it to be a paramount duty of us in the free states, due to the union of the states and perhaps to liberty itself, paradox though it may seem, to let the slavery of the other states alone." Unquote. This is the great emancipator. But Lincoln, as much of the country, feels that the only way that slavery will end is through legislative action, ultimately amendments to the Constitution. The paradox of what Lincoln is saying is that to agitate against slavery endangered the preservation of the Union and the Constitution that embodied freedom. And we will see that during Taylor's presidency, and Fillmore's presidency, as well as those leading up to the Civil War. Lincoln continued, "Northerners should never act to prevent, quote, slavery from dying a natural death," unquote, or finding new places in which to thrive. So let's get back to Zachary Taylor. We started yesterday. He is a slaveholder, but he firmly believes that legislatively slavery should not expand. In his inauguration, he says nothing about it during his brief inauguration address. Within the next few months from his inauguration, he opted for anti-slavery that Southern Whig supporters saw as betrayal. Remember, when Zachary Taylor ran for president, nobody knew his stance. Those in the South supported him because he was a slaveholder, so they thought he had their best interest at heart. He urged California, including Mormons around Salt Lake and New Mexico, to write constitutions and apply for statehood when Congress met in December of 1849. He correctly expected that both would bar slavery. In messages to Congress in December of 1849 and January of 1850, he urged them to admit California and New Mexico as soon as their constitutions arrived in Washington, D.C., with no language from Congress about slavery. Federal courts could settle the boundary dispute between Texas and New Mexico once New Mexico became a state. Above all, Taylor warned Congress it must not attempt to organize territorial governments in the area, for it would revive dangerous sectional conflict over congressional prohibition of slavery in those territories. So you can see here Taylor, and we'll see it with Fillmore, we'll see it with Buchanan, although he's very squishy, Franklin Pierce, even Lincoln saying, hey, we will do anything possible to save the Union, including allowing slavery to remain. Drafting a constitution that prohibited slavery, California applied for admission as a free state in 1850. Remember, as states are coming into the Union, the concern is keeping an equal balance of slave and free states so that neither those for slavery or those against would gain an upper hand in Congress. At that time, in 1850, there were 30 states in the Union, 15 free, 15 slave. Taylor's proposed solution of allowing residents in Mexican cession lands to decide the issue of slavery in new state constitutions would have added 2 to 3 free states, upsetting that very delicate north-south balance in the Senate. With much at stake, the stage was set for a clash or a compromise. Many Southern Democrats responded to Taylor's position by calling for a Secession Convention. This is in 1850. We're still 10 years out from the Civil War. A firm believer in national supremacy, much like Andrew Jackson. Think of the nullification crisis. Taylor told Southern leaders that he would hang anyone who tried to disrupt the Union by force or conspiracy. Cooler heads worked to come up with a compromise that would allow the controversy to pass. The debate over the proposed solutions was one of the most prolonged, significant, and contentious episodes in American history. Heavy hitters politically: Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun, William Seward contributed weighty arguments and opinions that captivated the country from January through September of 1850. Clay, Webster, and others hoped that a strong fugitive slave law and organization of territorial rather than state governments for New Mexico and Utah without any congressional prohibition of slavery would enable Southerners to accept California's admission as a free state. The compromise idea appealed to some Southerners, especially those against secession in 1850, because it would put the federal government on record as legal protector of slavery in the South where it existed. Calhoun, up until the time he dies, March 31st of 1850, opposed Clay. Jefferson Davis took over Calhoun's Southern leadership in opposition to Clay's proposals. Taylor also opposed Clay's proposals. When Taylor died unexpectedly on July 9th, forces for compromise pushed their efforts through the Great Compromise of 1850 in September of that year. Millard Fillmore, who succeeds Taylor because he's the vice president, signs the bill into law. Taylor took a strong stand on the Texas-New Mexico border dispute, promising personally to lead an army against Texas should it use force to occupy disputed lands. Think back to Washington and the Whiskey Rebellion. Think of Jackson as well and the nullification crisis. Taylor paid close attention to Native American affairs in Florida and Texas, the cholera epidemic in New York and New Orleans, which killed more than 5,000, and ceremonial affairs of state. Taylor thought the president should stand above party politics. He appointed cabinet members who represented all sections and interests of the country. None were prominent Washington, D.C. politicians. He delegated most patronage decisions that required firing Democrats and appointing Whigs to key positions in his cabinet. He gave great authority to his cabinet, using it like a council of war. There's a book out now called The Cabinet, which talks about Washington creating the cabinet. George Washington is the president who created the cabinet. He, like Taylor, based the idea of the cabinet on councils of war that he held during the Revolution. Taylor refused to develop a close working relationship with Congress. He's not the first to feel that way, and he won't be the last. Neither Taylor nor his Secretary of State, John M. Clayton, had much experience in foreign affairs. Taylor was not directly involved in either foreign policy formation or diplomacy. His administration acted to stop an expedition filibustering against Cuba, supported the efforts of German liberals in the revolutions of 1848 in German states, and engaged in verbal clashes with France and Portugal over various reparation disputes. It also confronted Spain about the arrest of several Americans charged with piracy and assisted Great Britain's search for a team of lost explorers in the Arctic. Taylor's most important policy move involved delicate negotiations with Great Britain over American plans to build a canal across Nicaragua. The plan was opposed by Great Britain, who claimed a special status in neighboring Honduras. The resulting treaty, known as the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, was Taylor's last act of state. It proved to be a landmark agreement. Both sides agreed to renounce control or dominion over any canal that might be built. The treaty effectively decreased American commitments to manifest destiny as formal policy while recognizing the supremacy of American interests in Central America. It was an important step in the development of the American-English alliance that emerged in the second half of the 19th century. Taylor's sudden death shocked the nation. After attending July 4th orations most of the day, he walked along the Potomac River before returning to the White House. Hot and tired, he drank iced water and ate large quantities of cherries and fruit, which were most likely tainted. Taylor suffered severe stomach pains for 5 days. Diagnosed as suffering from what was called cholera morbus by his doctors, Taylor ate slivers of ice until his body began rejecting fluids. At 10 in the morning on July 9th, Taylor called his wife. He told her, quote, I have always done my duty. I am ready to die. My only regret is for the friends I leave behind me, unquote. His funeral took place on July 13th. 100,000 lined the funeral route in Washington, D.C. The hearse was followed by D.C. dignitaries, military units, Taylor's horse, known as Old Whitey, and Taylor's family. Behind them, a line of military units, officials, and citizens stretched in procession for more than 2 miles. His final resting place was in Louisville, site of the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery and Monument today. So, as we had talked earlier, we'll just step back a minute. In the 1820s, being a white male rather than owning property became the qualification for voting. Only white males older than 21 could vote in the 1848 presidential election. At that time, states determined qualifications for suffrage and allowed aliens who were not citizens to cast ballots. Neither free black men in all but a few states nor women of any race could vote. Given these constraints, nowhere in the world was the right to vote as widespread as it was in America. In 1848, almost 2.9 million votes were cast in the 30 states, about 73% of the electorate. These voters amounted to 13% of America's population of 22 million. From 1840 to 1850, the U.S. population grew from 17 million to 23 million. That's a 35% increase. 15% lived in cities or towns of 2,000 or more in 1850, compared to 11% in 1840. 1.7 million immigrants arrived in America during that decade, mostly from Germany, Ireland, and Great Britain. In the summer of 1848, 300 people attended a women's rights convention at Seneca Falls, New York. Among resolutions passed was one calling for the right of women to vote. Of course, we're still more than 70 years out from the 19th Amendment being passed. Taylor's opinion on the convention or on the meeting is not known, but it is likely that he heard about it because the popular press ridiculed the idea of female suffrage. Amazing. Taylor always encouraged his daughters to obtain as much education as possible, and he had little difficulty thinking of them as capable individuals. But he was no populist when it came to voting, female voting. He distrusted the popular vote and lined up with Whigs who preferred minimum property qualifications for suffrage. He most likely believed that women had their hands full managing the private sphere of family life and that politics should be left to men. As far as immigration is concerned, Taylor lived too far to the west to have been greatly affected by the five-fold increase in immigration to America in the 1830s. Most new immigrants settled in eastern urban centers, this would be the Irish, or the mid-Atlantic, this would be Germans. As president, Taylor looked kindly upon immigration of German intellectuals and liberal reformers to America following the collapse of German revolutions of 1848. There is nothing in Taylor's correspondence, most of which was lost to roving Union soldiers who sacked Taylor's family home in Louisiana during the Civil War. There's nothing in his personal correspondence to suggest that he ever expressed an opinion on social reform movements that swept America in the 1830s. We've talked about these temperance movements, evangelism, anti-Masonry, utopianism, immigration limits, prison reform, abolitionism, or women's rights. As a slave owner, Taylor supported slavery and found nothing morally offensive. He thought that abolitionists were out of touch extremists. That truly is the way most of America, including Abraham Lincoln, saw abolitionists. Remember, abolitionists did not think that slavery could be wiped out legally and legislatively. They were looking to do it through what some considered violent acts. One of the most interesting episodes about Taylor and slavery was his refusal to seize slaves held by the Seminole Indians after their defeat in Florida. Resisting strong demands by Florida whites, Taylor allowed Native Americans to keep their slaves, most of whom had run away from their white owners. As a lifelong Native American fighter, Taylor participated in numerous wars. He respected Native Americans as fighters and spent much of his service career trying to protect them from having their treaty-designated lands overrun by unscrupulous white settlers. He shared the common view of Native Americans as potentially dangerous savages to be controlled. Taylor is not remembered as a great president, primarily because he only served 16 months. He was non-political when politics, parties, and presidential leadership demanded close ties with political operatives. Taylor's outsider philosophy kept him out of touch with Congress. He never addressed the legislature with a clear policy statement, nor did he use his influence to direct legislation except on statehood for California and New Mexico. He thought that the president's role should be limited to vetoing unconstitutional legislation, and he should give in to Congress on matters of domestic concern. What he said about federal economic policy in his only annual message to Congress was pretty much ignored due to preoccupation with the territorial issue and slavery. In foreign policy, his treaty with Great Britain on Central America, the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, is seen as an important step in decreasing America's commitment to manifest destiny. Many of his political contemporaries thought that it went too far in respecting England's claim to power in the Americas. As we've said, Taylor was a slave owner who wanted to ban the spread of slavery into the Western territories acquired from Mexico. He was the triumphant military conqueror of Mexico who saw little need for manifest destiny as a foreign policy. He was an army general who shied away from war as an instrument of state. A stern military commander who avoided decisive actions as the president, he was committed to preserving the Union even if it meant using force against secessionists. At the time of his death, Taylor was under severe pressure from Whigs to replace his unpopular cabinet. Had he done so, it might have improved relations with the congressional wing of the Whig Party. Had he lived, there might not have been a compromise of 1850, which we'll talk about more shortly, or potentially even a civil war, because the South was still too disunited in 1850 to form a viable secession movement. Taylor's unflinching support, had he lived, for the immediate statehood of the Western territories might have changed history. He had surprised many when he stamped out Santa Anna at the Battle of Buena Vista. If Taylor had survived, would he have been able to stamp out the spread of slavery westward? A question that will remain unanswered. Next up is Millard Fillmore, who was the vice president under Taylor and assumed office upon Taylor's death. The issue of slavery continued to plague Taylor's administration after his death. Discussion focused on whether to adopt the Compromise of 1850. The election of 1848, as we discussed, turned on the question of whether to allow the spread of slavery. In the Senate, Henry Clay bundled several provisions into a single omnibus bill to attempt to compromise on slavery. Clay's bill entailed the organization of the Utah and New Mexico territories on a popular sovereignty basis, meaning that slavery, whether or not it would be allowed in those territories, would be decided by the local populations and government, not the federal government. Also, California statehood and the prohibition of public slave auctions in Washington, D.C. It also offered a new Fugitive Slave Law. This piece of legislation decreed that runaway slaves apprehended anywhere in America would be returned to their masters if new federally appointed commissioners decided that they were fugitives. It denied due process to such slaves and allowed authorities to arrest African American suspects and return them to slave territory, whether the arrested person was a slave or not. It's crazy. It empowered federal marshals to enforce the law. The Fugitive Slave Law also cited severe penalties for noncompliance. The act horrified many in the country openly opposed to slavery. They vowed to fight its passage. Clay urged Taylor to join the debate over the compromise, but Taylor wanted no part of it. Taking a wait-and-see approach, Taylor contested some of the positions of the compromise and threatened a veto. Gradually, support in Congress for the compromise fell, and the omnibus bill was tied up in endless Senate debates by mid-1850. Millard Fillmore watched much of the debate from the sidelines because, as Taylor's vice president, Taylor kept him out of his administration, basically. When Taylor died, July 9th of 1850, a couple days before his death, Millard Fillmore told Taylor that if the Compromise of 1850 came to a vote in the Senate, Fillmore would cast his vice presidential tie-breaking vote to pass it. The cabinet, who'd barely spoken to Fillmore because he was kept at arm's length by Taylor, unanimously resigned. In days, America was governed by a new order. Fillmore appointed Whigs to his cabinet with pro-union, pro-compromise views, completely different from the cabinet that Taylor had put in place. At the end of July, Senator Clay introduced a modified omnibus combination of bills. Fillmore pressured Congress to consider the original bill rather than the watered-down version that Clay had just put forward. The angry tone of the national debate, heightened. In Congress, forces for and against slavery fought over every word of the bill. Sound like our current Congress. Both sides chipped away at the bill's provisions, and support for it fell, to Fillmore's deep disappointment. Clay left Washington, D.C. A new player from the opposing party entered the fray. Stephen Douglas, 37 years old, headed the committee charged with partitioning new U.S. territories while serving in the House. He is from Illinois. Elected to the Senate in 1847, he now headed its Committee on Territories. Instead of fighting one great battle over the bill, Douglas fought 5 smaller ones. The compromise was reworked into a quintet of bills, 5 smaller bills, with each having enough support from one section of the country or another to assure passage. One by one, the bills squeaked through Congress. As a result, Texas settled its border dispute with New Mexico and received $10 million for conceding territories. California gained statehood as a free state. New Mexico and Utah were granted territorial status without specifying policy on slavery for either one, affirming the principle of popular sovereignty in deciding the issue. Again, it will be decided by people living in the territories, not the federal government. The Fugitive Slave Law passed easily. The final bill involved Washington, D.C. Slave trading, but not slavery itself, became illegal in the District of Columbia. Congress worked well into the fall in its longest session to date. Fillmore signed the bills, considering their passage a triumph of inter-party cooperation that had kept the Union intact. And that's the bottom line, keeping the Union together. Many Americans did not see it that way. Those with strong feelings about slavery, the compromise, seemed to offer something for everyone to dislike. Northern abolitionists were enraged by the Fugitive Slave Law. Several states subsequently passed laws prohibiting enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law. Southern pro-slavery forces were dismayed by restrictions on slavery in California and the District of Columbia. They also doubted the government's commitment to enforce the Fugitive Slave Law. Fillmore struggled to keep these factions appeased. Responding to Southern pressure and secession threats, he decided to vigorously enforce the Fugitive Slave Law. In 1851, a Maryland man combed Pennsylvania, hunting down runaway slaves he owned. One of these slaves killed his master when the slave was found by the master. The incident led Fillmore to support treason charges against more than 40 persons, black and white, supposedly connected to the killing. A Supreme Court justice ruled that opposition to the Fugitive Slave Law did not qualify as a treasonous act. Later in his administration, Fillmore sought to enforce the law in his home state of New York, ordering the apprehension of an escaped slave. A band of armed abolitionists rescued the slave from state authorities. Attempts to prosecute them failed. Incidents like these convinced Northerners that Millard Fillmore was appeasing the South. Anti-slavery politicians made considerable inroads to power at state and local levels. This will lead to the formation of the Republican Party. To counteract Northern uneasiness, Fillmore ordered General Winfield Scott to strengthen forts in South Carolina to give Southerners second thoughts about secession. Legislatures in northern states passed what were called personal liberty laws, unquote, which forbade state judges in helping slaveholders and extended to African Americans the right to trial by jury. Whig Party itself began to fall apart from the strain of the conflicting points of view on slavery. Remember, Northern Whigs were against it, Southern Whigs were for it, so that's splintering. Despite congressional debates that raged about slavery, Fillmore had a foreign policy agenda that emphasized expanding trade while decreasing American commitments outside the Western Hemisphere. For 3 centuries, Japan had been a completely isolated nation. American shipping interests identified it as a prime location. to resupply ships on the way into China and Southeast Asia. Assisted by Secretary of State Daniel Webster, Fillmore ordered a trade mission to Japan by Commodore Matthew Perry. Although the mission was not fully completed until the succeeding administration of Franklin Pierce, the policy opened Japan for trade with the rest of the world. Elsewhere in the Pacific, Fillmore showed strong resolve in preventing the Hawaiian Islands from falling into French or British hands. When the French government tried to force an annexation agreement on Hawaii's king, Fillmore warned Napoleon III that America would not stand for such action. Taylor, as we had talked, had signed the Clayton Bulwer Treaty of 1850. It prevented America and Great Britain from claiming further territories in Central America. Both nations continued to angle for influence in the region and control the construction of a future canal project connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, the Panama Canal, of course, which is done much later in the early 1900s. Fillmore dispatched warships to protect American merchant vessels from British interference. He also took a hard stand against private American interests, sending mercenaries of their own into the region to gain influence. Agricultural interests in the South, weary of defending their slave-reliant economy to America, had been interested in growing the slave-based economy into Cuba. Remember, Polk, when he was president, tried to purchase Cuba from the Spanish, but they said no way. Federal authorities attempted to prevent, let me go back. Early in Taylor's administration, a Venezuelan named Narciso Lopez had raised an army of hundreds of Americans, mostly Southerners, with the intention of invading Cuba. What does that sound like? The Bay of Pigs, a century later. Federal authorities attempted to prevent Lopez from leaving American shores with this force, but he managed to sail out of New Orleans. This expedition managed to land in Cuba, but failed to generate a rebellion. A second invasion during the summer of 1851 eluded Fillmore's attempts to stop it. This time, routed on the beaches by the Spanish, the insurgents were either executed or enslaved. The incident was blamed largely on Fillmore. Southerners condemned him for not supporting the invasion. Northern Democrats criticized Fillmore for his subsequent apology to the Spanish. British and the French sent warships to guarantee Spanish sovereignty over Cuba. Fillmore had Secretary of State Edward Everett, who replaced Webster in 1852, warn the Europeans that under certain circumstances, control of the island, quote, might be almost essential to our safety, unquote. This tough talk against European powers won Fillmore some respect from his critics. Fillmore did little to align America against repressive imperial governments in Europe. When Austria protested that America was siding with Hungarians in their attempts to free themselves from the Habsburg Empire, Fillmore enunciated the doctrine from his annual message of 1850 that America believed in the inalienable right of each people to establish, quote, that form of government which it may deem most conducive to the happiness and prosperity of its citizens, unquote. Fillmore did not back these words with actions. In 1851, Congress invited the Hungarian patriot Kossuth to visit America. Fillmore and Secretary of State Webster, worried that the American people might want the U.S. to back Kossuth, warned him at a state dinner that although they supported his efforts at national liberation, the effort would have to be carried out by Hungarians. Democrats created a group called Young America, the America Movement, to back Eastern European liberation, but it was designed to exploit domestic policies, not influence events in Europe. In the election of 1852, Fillmore showed little enthusiasm for serving another term. He did no campaigning and did not share his intentions on running again. In March of 1851, using an editor who was allied to him, Fillmore planted a newspaper report that he was retiring from office. Daniel Webster announced his candidacy. The candidacy of his own Secretary of State did not bother Fillmore. Webster's announcement, however, was the last straw for Fillmore. He tried to formally withdraw until others in the cabinet talked him out of it. The Whig Party, as I said earlier, was fragmenting over slavery. None of the leading candidates, Millard Fillmore, Daniel Webster, or General Winfield Scott, appealed to a majority of the Whig Party members. Fillmore was disliked by abolitionists for enforcing the Fugitive Slave Law, as we've talked about. Webster was old and sick. Southern Whigs disliked Scott, who had served as Jackson's personal emissary in 1832 when Andrew Jackson threatened to use federal troops in South Carolina as part of the nullification crisis. Whigs opened their convention in Baltimore in mid-June of 1852. Fillmore actually led in the early balloting. Webster's cause was all but hopeless. He stubbornly clung to his delegates. They slowly defected to General Winfield Scott. On the 53rd ballot, Scott was nominated. The convention was the end of the Whig Party as a national force. With Southern opposition to Scott, he was unelectable. Many Southern Whigs abstained, with some actually supporting the Democrat Franklin Pierce. Pierce ends up winning. As we've talked about, in the 1850s, or as we will be talking about, I should say, in the 1850s, America was rapidly becoming an industrial power. Clipper ships mastered the voyage, which was dangerous, around Cape Horn, which opened up the West and the Pacific to trade from the East. Remember, we don't have the Panama Canal yet. Whaling vessels brought oil needed for industry and households from eastern coastal waters. John Rockefeller has not done his thing yet with oil and production. Wages were rising, but unions were organizing workers to press for better working conditions. While craftsmen were better organized, most factory workers were not. The price of wheat and other crops was rising, luring farmers from the East and Northern Europe into the Midwest and Plain states. Immigration ran at a high level during the Taylor-Fillmore era, with more than 50,000 a year entering America. Most new arrivals, as we've said, were from Germany, Great Britain, and Ireland. Legal restrictions on immigration would not come until the Civil War. Some eastern states began levying taxes on new arrivals, but these were disallowed by the Supreme Court in 1849. Between the mid-1840s and the mid-1850s, nearly 3 million people emigrated to the United States. By the time Fillmore was president, discovery of gold in California led 100,000 Americans there. Although few struck it rich, many stayed and were helped by rapidly developing communications and transportation technologies. America truly becomes a bicoastal nation. The home of the Mormons was organized as the Utah Territory in 1850. Fillmore appointed the Mormon leader Brigham Young as territorial governor. Under Young, federal authority remained non-existent, and Mormons ignored decisions of federal judges. Also in 1850, Fillmore was nominated, or pardon me, let me take that back. The same year that Fillmore was nominated as vice president, Elizabeth Cady Stanton assembled the Seneca Falls Convention in New York. This is 1848. She worked with Lucretia Mott and other activists on a statement of principles that began the modern women's suffrage and civil rights movement. During Fillmore's administration, Uncle Tom's Cabin, the definitive abolitionist literary work by Harriet Beecher Stowe, was published. It shed new light on slavery and helped to spread anti-slavery sentiment throughout the North. The 1850s saw the peak of the Underground Railroad. Although Congress reached a compromise over slavery in 1850, substantial minorities in the North and South condemned it. By championing the Compromise of 1850, Fillmore kept America from civil war for more than a decade. The political cost, however, was total. Slavery was the type of moral issue that terrified politicians because it offered no easy middle ground. Some have said slavery at that time, politically, is comparable to abortion today, but that's a rabbit hole I'm not going to go down. Debate in Congress over the issue during the Taylor-Fillmore term was so intense that fistfights were common. Many members carried pistols into the House and Senate chambers. It is no surprise that there were no two-term presidents between Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln. They really were prey for the most heated American social debate of the 1800s, slavery. Fillmore's accomplishments, while not great, were substantial. In addition to legislative engineering that passed the compromise, he conducted a disciplined, principled foreign policy. He handled flashpoints in Cuba, Hawaii, Eastern Europe, and Central America. For his entire political career, Fillmore was vulnerable to fringe causes. Fearing secret organizations, his first party was the distrustful anti-Masonic movement, and he blamed his loss in New York's governor's race on what he called foreign Catholics. Fillmore ended his career heading the Know Nothings, a party formed to oppose immigration. When he died, he was largely forgotten. President Grant issued a perfunctory statement on his death, and there was no mourning by Americans. Fillmore's political career encompassed the tortuous course toward two-party systems of today. Whigs were not cohesive to survive the slavery debate, while anti-Masonics and Know-Nothings were too extremist. When Fillmore sided with pro-slavery elements in ordering enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law, he guaranteed that he would be the last Whig president. He is the first modern two-party system the first modern two-party system of Whigs and Democrats succeeded only in dividing America by the 1850s. 7 years later, the election of the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, would guarantee civil war. That's where we're going to end today. Thank you so much for joining. Have a great weekend. We will be back on Monday at 5 p.m. Take good care.